So I just finished rewatching Kill la Kill for the first time in a while. Goes without saying, it's still one of the most exhilarating, emotional, best looking anime series out there, even over 10 years later. However, while my feelings towards the show haven't changed since the first time I watched it, what has changed is my take on Nui Harime. Most fans hate her. I hated her. And I think that's an intended, completely justified response. I mean, she's an absolutely merciless, sick and twisted crazy person whose entire existence is Lady Ragyo. Not to mention, while I always found her funny, she is rather annoying with that fake cutesy personality, and the fact she just won't stay down. But while I don't think it justifies her, or makes her a secretly good person deep down, you have to keep in mind, like Satsuki, she too is in fact a victim of Ragyo's grooming. And what's really interesting is that when you think about it, Nui and Satsuki each represent a different outcome of Ragyo's abuse. Quick warning that the topics in this video won't be for the faint of heart. Although they are ultimately very different people in terms of what they value and believe in, whose crimes really couldn't have a more obvious line between them in terms of moral reprehensibility, Ragyo unfortunately left a very big mark on Satsuki. In her mother instilled extreme authoritarian values. Like Ragyo, Satsuki only saw the value in others when they're useful to her cause. In fact, we hear Satsuki quote her mother more than on one occasion. They parallel each other in incredibly obvious ways, to the point where even characters in the show point out. In fact, for the pair of them, the idea that people only matter as far as their worth to the cause even extended to the way in which they viewed themselves. Ragyo was perfectly content being a puppet to the life fibers, being her sole motivation. Satsuki was more than willing to die if it meant putting a stop to her mother's nefarious goals. Although in ways they acted entirely selfishly, their motives were selfless. Morally, there was honestly not much separating them. That is, besides the one and only thing that drastically altered the path Satsuki took, her unwavering belief in justice, law and order. While Ragyo was a person who had absolutely no regard for right and wrong, desiring only what the primordial life fiber wanted, Satsuki Kiryuin was driven entirely by her sense of right and wrong. While she may not have been able to see humans as anything more than pigs in human clothing like her mother, she knew that feeding them to the life fibers was wrong, and ironically, given that it was meant to have the opposite effect, I believe this has everything to do with Ragyo Kiryuin's grooming of her. Grooming, when it comes in the form of sexual abuse, inflicts tremendous psychological damage on an individual. When it goes as the groomer intended, the victim becomes subservient to them, feeling as if they owe them sex and that their consent is inherent. They feel as if there is nothing wrong with the aberrant way their bodily autonomy is being disrespected, because they do not see themselves as a victim, nor their groomer as an abuser. However, the abuse can make the victim go in an entirely opposite direction when the grooming is unsuccessful. Satsuki's first encounter with injustice would certainly have been her mother's sexual abuse. I won't go into specifics, but if you've watched the show, you know the extent of her sexual exploitation, and you would notice that it's something Satsuki is utterly repulsed by. She didn't feel like she owed it to her mother at all. She felt violated. Instead of grooming her into complete submission as her mother had intended, she instead became entirely rebellious. Rightfully, she would have seen what her mother did to her as perverse and harmful, and instinctively, she would have been able to see how that extended to her plans with the covers. And of course, this isn't to disregard the role of the apparent murder of Satsuki's baby sister. If it wasn't for feeling the injustice of these deeds, perhaps she would have turned out much more like her mother. In the end though, Ragyo had sown her own seeds of destruction with her aberrant plot. Now, while Satsuki's crazy friends do indeed play a tremendous part in her growth as a character, equal to and perhaps more so than Ryuko did, keep in mind that every one of them had been recruited for the sake of Satsuki's cause. She had been opposing her mother since she was extremely young, and these people and their love and respect of her wouldn't have come into play until after she acquired her justice obsession. But now, of course, we have to talk about the inspiration for this video, Nui Harime. It's no secret that Nui was also a subject of Ragyo's sexual exploitation, as not only do we witness her molestation of this person she raised firsthand, we also see how incredibly hypersexual she turned out, immediately forming sexual interest in Ryuko, and having no understanding of boundaries. Likely, she has never known boundaries. Ragyo has also turned sexual gratification into some sort of sick reward system, and rather than being repulsed of it like Satsuki, she is extremely desperate to achieve it. But it's not so much Ragyo as a person that achieves that gratification, but more her praise and adoration, which she has been made dependent on deliberately. This is why her role of Grand Couturier is so important to her. Being useful means that she's appreciated. What Nui and Ragyo have between them is not real love, and honestly, I think this is something the poor girl is aware of deep down. I believe this because in her speech speech to Ryuko, where she literally reveals her heart to her, she mentions how lonely it feels to be a non-human being like her. Nui is a deceptive character, but what she's saying here seems to be coming from a genuine place. Always being besides her lady, why would she feel lonely unless she knew she was unloved? Ragyo, to put it bluntly, is Nui's entire life. She lives and breathes this awful woman. Everything she does is for her sake and her sake alone. And really, it's no surprise at all when she's never known anything different. While she's not physically trapped indoors or anything, she was groomed to be used as a tool for the Kiryuin clan and never had a normal life. Of course, this is apparent in her lack of social skills and having no real friends, something that certainly separates her from Satsuki. What separates her even more from Ragyo's biological daughter though, is the fact that Nui is an inorganic being, born of human DNA and life fibers. This, of course, is something that her lady exploits to the fullest extent. Ragyo has groomed this girl into believing that being born from the primordial life fiber means that she has absolutely no humanity inside her whatsoever, and that her choice was only ever to serve the life fibers. However, I believe this mindset does not come naturally to Nui, because perhaps her only desire that doesn't stem from her Ragyo praise kink is her curiosity and pettiness. When Nui acts on these emotions, that's her being human. These traits may be even more powerful than Ragyo's grooming, as she doesn't even consider apologizing to Ragyo for fighting over working. And I think the irony of her humanity being the one thing that leads her astray is very intentional, but as we know, it is not her humanity that ends up winning out in the end, but of course, her unwavering, so-called love for Lady Ragyo. When you take into account the fact that Ragyo's grooming, essay and the rest is what made her such a perfect pawn, the scene where Nui decapitates herself is even more disturbing than it already is. This isn't out of love, admiration or loyalty, this is done out of obsession for sexual gratification and self-fulfillment that she gets from her groomer's validation, and this dependency on sex and being useful had deliberately been instilled in her since infancy. But you want to know what's truly disturbing? Nui is Ryuko. Had Ryuko not been saved by her father as an infant. But if you need any more proof of this, just see what happens to Ryuko when Junketsu is sewn onto her, and Ragyo implants those twisted false memories of being raised by her. This girl becomes entirely dependent on the sexual gratification which her mother and Junketsu give her, and it makes her completely depravedly selfish to maintain said gratification. She's so utterly consumed by lust that she gives into her sexual impulses entirely, and ends up passionately kissing Nui, who she had hated more than anyone moments before the mind control. Even Mako, who had the power to bring Ryuko down even from her berserk form, almost isn't enough to drag her out of her ecstasy-induced state. Even if Nui had the stubborn and resilient mental fortitude of Ryuko Matoi, it would have still been very unlikely she would have turned out any other way. Nui probably wasn't born evil, even if she was birthed out of the primordial life fiber. In fact, we know for a fact life fibers don't make you inherently evil. Senketsu proves that idea false with his mere existence, and Ryuko and Nui both literally had the same heart. The tragic thing is, if Nui was allowed to have found her own crazy friends to steer her straight, or even had someone else raise her from the start, things would have almost certainly turned out differently. Stripped of her negative qualities, she's just a curious girl who loves fun, but she was doomed by Ragyo to always be exactly as she designed her to be: sadistic, selfish, and self-sacrificing. And that's what makes this character so tragic, yet so genius. Nui is the perfect narrative foil to Ryuko and Satsuki, because she is exactly what they too could have ended up like if things had gone differently. She shares almost identical circumstances to the pair of them respectively. On the surface, her existence technically is antithetical to what the show preaches about freedom, which is, as Ryuko puts it, people aren't clothing, people are people. Ragyo forced her to be the perfect pawn, ensuring that she always saw herself as clothing for Ragyo to use with no free will. In actuality though, it's clear that she was unsuccessful in entirely wringing out humanity out of Nui Harime. She still kinda sucks though.